Welcome to Thinking Class, Tom. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, John.
Well, I am really delighted you can join me because Santa Claus was very kind to me at Christmas, and I got your book, This Is Not America, which I enjoyed very much. I had actually seen you emerging into the public consciousness at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns. I'm a reader of Unheard, and you were one of the few heterodox voices, I suppose, who were raising questions about Britain's imbibing of American culture wars, but also current events at the time. For instance, the death of George Floyd, the ramifications that had in American society, which then very quickly came across the pond, as it were. And in the book, I think it's fair to say you're critical of white liberals who sacralize ethnic minorities, as well as activists more broadly of almost any ethnic stripe who broadly seek to define people by racial categories. So your book's ultimately about Britain importing America's culture wars to Britain. Why is that a problem, and why are we not the same?
That is a problem for various reasons. I think one of the most significant reasons why that's a problem is looking at race through that rigidly abstract or Americanized way doesn't allow us to actually identify the various inequalities in British society. So, for example, if we look at the education system, the experiences of Black British people are not all the same. Black Caribbean pupils, Black Caribbean boys in particular, tend to struggle more in the education system than Black African pupils. And if we care genuinely about the inequalities that affect society, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than simply looking at inequalities only through race. So in my book and in various other articles that I write, I emphasize the importance of class to explaining the various inequalities that affect British society. And all too often, class is not incorporated enough into discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And without any recognition of the importance of class, the importance of other factors such as culture, family formation, geography, various other factors, we can't actually address the inequalities in our society. And the focus of my book is to give us a more grounded approach, a more granular approach, an approach that emphasizes the importance of nuance and specificity in identifying inequality. I think another problem that I have with the current discourse around race, the current orthodoxies around race, is I find it very condescending to ethnic minority people, to just view them simply as victims of racism and almost nothing else. I find that kind of attitude extremely condescending, extremely patronizing. And I think if we genuinely want to show respect to any individual, irrespective of their particular racial, ethnic, or religious background, we need to treat them with a greater level of dignity rather than this condescending tone that I see often amongst people that claim to be anti-racist.
That's a good point, and one I know you make well throughout the book, and you use or you bolster your argument using lines of reasoning by famous African American commentators across the political spectrum. One of them being Thomas Sowell, and I know he's quite famous for popularizing a couple of notions. The first being that there's a tendency for policymakers to view any disparity as being a sign of discrimination, being number one. And obviously, as you just pointed out, there is a whole multi-variant analysis that could be made as to why outcomes turn out to be differently. But he also talks a lot about policymakers having mascots, and those mascots are about feel-good politics in the end, and it is to make a statement about where you stand, but whether it actually goes on to create an outcome that would address the situation that was supposedly being addressed is another question entirely. What do you make of that?
Of the first point or the second point?
The second point. Yes, I did just hit you with a blizzard of points there.
Yeah. I think Thomas Sowell is a very profoundly perceptive thinker, and I think one of the problems with many policymakers, especially when it comes to addressing issues relating to race and ethnicity and so forth, is the sort of simplistic attitude that they bring into it. The lack of actually understanding the various components that go into not only a person's identity, but also a person's condition. So to go back to the example that I mentioned earlier about the differences between Black Caribbean pupils and Black African pupils, any kind of policy that says, oh, we need to improve the lives of Black British pupils, teenagers, children, without actually acknowledging the fact that certain Black pupils tend to do much better, Black West African pupils in particular, than others in terms of education, those policies will not actually address what they claim to address, because they're not taking into account the fact that the kinds of social condition, the kinds of inequality that they try to reform are not uniform across the ethnic minority groups that they claim to speak on behalf of. To use an American example, and the example of affirmative action is quite interesting, because in America, one of the groups, ethnic groups that do best in terms of getting into the Ivy League colleges and gaining extremely prestigious professional jobs are West African communities as well. Nigerian Americans are amongst the most affluent ethnic minority American groups. And if affirmative action is something that's simply focused on race without taking into account things like class and national background, or any other kind of factor, and if affirmative action benefits Nigerian Americans disproportionately, rather than Black Americans who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, then that just strikes me as completely unfair. And that just strikes me as completely anathema to any kind of reasonable social justice. So any policy implementation, therefore, needs to be grounded in acknowledging the multiple ways in which inequality manifests itself, rather than simply being shaped by a totalizing racial approach.
Affirmative action seems to be something that comes back into the public consciousness every now and then and ends up under the spotlight. And I think we're probably there again now. And it's receiving criticism. In this case, I think it's been generated by events over in the States, our imperial overlords, as it were, the ones who set the tone for the culture. But post-October 7th is something which people have been very cognizant of was the congressional hearings about a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel demonstrations on campuses at MIT, Penn, and Harvard. And without running through the whole gamut of what went on there, is ultimately their responses, which seems totally contradictory to how they had dealt with smaller scale aggressions on campus, microaggressions, they'd call them.
Yeah.
Ended up costing them their jobs. They all resigned. But one of them in particular, Claudine Gay, was someone who was the president of Harvard, had published 11 academic papers throughout the course of a career. I'm not an academic, but academics who found this out thought that's outrageous because most people have to publish many more than those just to get tenure. And she was also the spearheading DEI initiatives at Harvard.
Yeah.
And so there were suggestions that she made it as far as she did due to affirmative action, but she's also from a background of very wealthy family, and
Yes.
and so it links to the point you were making about Nigerian Americans, although she's not Nigerian American, in America.
She's from, her family's from Haiti, so she's Caribbean in terms of background.
Yeah. And which is also surprising because Haiti is such a poor country. So when I heard that was surprising. But I suppose my question is you're talking a little bit about policy and how the blunt instruments are too blunt to make a difference and potentially cause harm. What are your views on affirmative action?
I think it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. So I think if as I said earlier, if affirmative action is simply predicated on race without taking into account any other factor that might shape inequality, then I would be totally opposed to it. Because as I'm sure you know, there's been over the past few years lawsuits against Ivy League colleges in America, which have been organized by Asian American students and their families as well. And these Asian American people feel that affirmative action is actually discriminating against them. It's put in their sort of access to these elite colleges under threat, essentially. So I think it should be any kind of policy that seeks to address inequality needs to be more multivaried in how it considers sort of addressing these inequalities. But there's also another issue, which is that if we focus simply on merit, if we apply the principle of meritocracy, then that would lead to a situation where certain colleges are sort of disproportionately filled by Asian students, and particular African students as well. And if we sort of had that colorblind, completely meritocratic approach, I think that would undermine one of the key tenets of the current roguish understandings of racism. Because as you said, the first thing you mentioned about Thomas Sowell was his argument about the disparity fallacy. And the disparity fallacy is the fallacy that any kind of disparity in society is necessarily evidence of racism. But if that was the case, how could you explain, for example, the disproportionate numbers of Asian students excelling in American colleges and schools, or to use a British example, the fact that British Indians and British Chinese pupils are the most academically successful ethnic minority groups. Um, even much more so than white British students. How could you
Mm.
explain all of this if we stick to the idea that racism means that racial disparities are caused by racial oppression rather than the disparities being caused by other factors, some of which are quite benign. So I do think the affirmative action issue is interesting simply because it illustrates a lot of the tensions and contradictions of this current voguish conception of racism.
Yeah, the point you're making about the lower performance or lower life outcomes within the white British population in comparison to certain ethnic groups is really interesting, and one that is frequently untouched. But I think it harks straight back to the point you're making about social class as well, which is, I think, on an absolute numbers basis, white working class boys are they're the biggest problem when it comes to life outcomes in the country. They lag behind pretty much every group, and I think that's something that's quite interesting insofar as I remember back to the early 2000s when you couldn't get moved for tabloid newspapers referring to people as chavs, which is ultimately it's definitely a judgment on culture, and if there's anything going on in their lives, it's their fault. People were very quick to be able to point that finger, but everyone seems very afraid to touch the culture question, the family question with any other group, and when it comes to policy instruments to try and lift out someone who is part of the white British group, they're overlooked because it would be seen as anathema to this idea of you're white, thus you have privilege. So there's just so much stuff going on in there, and I don't really know our way out of it. And when you see an election year coming and a Labour government coming, where you've got the leader of the opposition saying, if we're to form a government, which they probably will, then we're going to bring in a Race Equality Act, which is going to be fundamentally underpinned by the idea of structural racism. And that flies in the face of everything we've just spoken about. So it seems to me like the problem crystallizes that we've just been talking about. What do you think about
the
all
idea
that?
of a Race Equality Act is also absurd because we already have an Equality Act, the 2010 Equality Act, and race and racism is already covered by that act. So it just seems, amongst everything else, it just seems completely pointless to me to introduce such a legislation. To go back to what you said about the importance of social class. So I went to a state secondary school in Southeast London, and my school was diverse in terms of race and ethnicity and religion, but also diverse in terms of socioeconomic background as well. There were a lot of middle-class kids in my school, and also a lot of working-class kids as well. But one striking thing, which I only realized in retrospect, was that the white working-class kids in my school were friends or friendly with ethnic minority kids of whatever class background. And the white middle-class kids in my school were also friends or friendly with ethnic minority kids of whatever socioeconomic background. But the striking thing is that the white working-class kids and the white middle-class kids were not friends or friendly with each other. And I think that illustrates the extent to which class is still the main social dividing line in British society.
You're absolutely right there. I mean, I grew up in northeast England, and not in one of the post-industrial towns, but northeast England is hardly renowned for its economic opportunities, as it were. And my school, as you can imagine, being a small Northumbrian market town, was 99% white. But there was a clear class divide, as you mentioned, with regards to friendship groups. There was snobbery, there was reverse snobbery. But when I moved to Manchester, for 7 years after I left school early, I was in retail and sales, and rubbed shoulders with people from every ethnic minority, religious background. And exactly what you just mentioned was playing out, is we all broke bread together, we all went out together.
Yeah.
There was none of those things. And actually, what was quite interesting is the things that did differentiate us, like our religion or our ethnic backgrounds, we actually spoke about it. And we had, this was also pre-smartphone era. And I remember sitting in the tea room in the Arndale Centre in Manchester, talking openly about these things. No one was really, no one was distracted by what was going on their phone. You know, if they wanted to talk about religion and its impact and whatever, that they would. And nothing was taboo almost. And it's quite striking to see how things have changed in 15, 16 years.
It is. And because I think and I think this is one of the key differences between the UK and America, is that in America, schools tend to be segregated more by race, whereas in the UK, they tend to be segregated more by class. And when people think about a relationship between the education system in the UK and class, they often pit it as the difference between fee-paying schools and state schools. But I think even within state schools, you still see class divides playing out. And I think one of the reasons, for example, why America is very different to the UK when it comes to what I just said, is that in America, the share of the American population that's Black is about 12-13%, whereas in the UK, the share of the UK population that's Black is about 4%. But in America, there are so many towns and cities in America, especially across many southern states, where the majority of the population is Black. So if you're a Black American, it's much more easier to have an exclusively Black social circle than it is in the UK, because the share of the Black British population is just much more smaller than the share of the Black American population. And the area in the UK of the largest number of Black people is, of course, London. But even in London, the share of the population of London that's Black is only about 14%, I believe. So still a very small minority of the overall population. So yeah, I think one of the key differences definitely is that in America, in terms of schools, there is much more segregation predicated on race, whereas in the UK, it's much more segregation predicated on class.
Yeah, and I know you write in your book about the interracial relationships that are so prevalent in Britain, and just how massive our mixed race population between white British and any of the Black ethnic minority backgrounds have become. And if you look at the English national football team, whether it's Calvin Phillips or Kyle Walker, we've got some of our most prominent people in the public eye. Are, I suppose, they are the product of that success story, which is so often overlooked.
That's a very good point. So the largest growing ethnic minority group in the UK is the mixed race population. And in fact, the UK is one of the very few societies in the world that has a sizable mixed race population that came about as a consequence of romantic love rather than rape. So of course, America has got a very large mixed race population, and Brazil also has a very large mixed race population. But the reason for those mixed race populations are far more sinister than the UK's mixed race population.
The mixed race identity question is very interesting as well, and something that you write about so well, bringing up stories of people who were part British, part Colombian, and then they'd go for want a channel their inner Colombian, then they go to Colombia thinking this is a place for me. I feel out of place in Britain, and then get there and go, God, I'm so British. And a friend and colleague of mine, he's actually Tom, a very similar story to you. I used to work with him when I lived in London, and he was born in Nigeria. He came over a little bit later in life with his mum, and he was 12 years old, and it took him a little while to get up to speed, I suppose, with the way things are done around here. But the more and more he went back to visit Nigeria, the more and more, whilst he still had an affinity for the country, he found himself feeling really out of place, and not even just within himself. It was because people just knew he wasn't from round there. So he talked quite a lot about this hard line to tread, where he feels an affinity to Nigeria, but no longer feels Nigerian. He is British, but then there's also there can sometimes be some woolliness there as well. Do you experience anything like that within yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So the last time I was in Nigeria was nearly 2 years ago, and I did definitely feel more. I definitely did feel more British while I was in Nigeria. And in fact, the reason why I was in Nigeria was because one of my older brothers was getting married. And this brother in question lives in America and was getting married in Nigeria to a Black American woman. And by Black American, I mean a woman whose ancestors were enslaved Africans. And my brother's bride invited many of her family members and friends to the wedding. And for many of these relatives and friends, it was their very first time visiting an African country. And I think many of them expected a sort of homecoming, a sort of return of the prodigal son or the prodigal daughter, to use a biblical analogy. But what was most striking from the perspective of the native Nigerians was not the fact that these Black American people were Black. The most striking thing from the perspective of the native Nigerians was the fact that these Black American people were American. And of course, that makes sense, because Nigeria is a country where over 99% of the population is Black. So, of course, race is not at the forefront of the average Nigerian person's mind. Race is not one of the factors that divide Nigerian society. Other things such as religion, region, class, all these other factors profoundly shape Nigerian society rather than race. And in fact, there is a very famous Nigerian novelist called Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she once said that the first time she realized she was a Black person was when she went to America for the first time. So that sort of way that many Africans see themselves is not the same as the way that Black Americans see themselves. When Black Americans often look into the mirror, they see their racial identity. Whereas when many Africans look into the mirror, they see their tribal identity, their religious identity, their national identity. So when Black Americans come to Africa, the response of many Africans is not to see their race, it's to see their nationality, it's to see what distinguishes them from the native Nigerian flock rather than what sort of connects them to it. And I think this is something that also reminds me of an episode of the TV show The Sopranos. Have you watched The Sopranos?
Yeah, it's an excellent episode. You're about to reference. Go on with much pleasure. I'll listen to this.
So so for any of your listeners that don't know, The Sopranos is a show about Italian American mobsters from New Jersey, and in the first season of the show, there's one episode where the Italian American mobsters go to Italy, and one of the characters, one of the Italian American mobsters, a character called Holy Walnuts, sort of traces around Italy as a sort of with a desire to reconnect with his Italian roots. But the only awkward fact is that he can't speak Italian. And these Italian American characters, even though they sometimes sprinkle Italian words into their conversations and so forth, they can't actually speak Italian. And so from the perspective of the native Italians, these Italian American people are Americans first and foremost, rather than Italians. And so I think when we talk about identity, that's why it's important to always emphasize context rather than assuming that identity, especially racial identity or ethnic identity, is just this abstract thing which can be divorced from any kind of context. I think that's completely misguided.
Tom, what do you think the long-term practical consequences might be if we don't get to a common understanding that you just outlined, where we see the contextual identity rather than let's put people in racial categories?
I think one of the long-term consequences is it leads many Black British people or Black people in the in Western countries to feel alienation. And in fact, despite the title of my book, as you mentioned earlier, many of the thinkers that have most influenced my ideas about race are themselves Black American writers and thinkers. You mentioned Thomas Sowell earlier. I would also mention James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison as well. And what many of these writers and thinkers emphasized is that when it comes to being a Black American person, we shouldn't simply focus on the Black aspect of that identity. We should also emphasize the American aspect as well. And I apply that insight to what it means to be a Black British person, because as you mentioned earlier about your Nigerian friend, he felt more British being in Nigeria, and that's something that equally applies to me as well. So I think the long-term consequences of not contextualizing racial identity and racial categories is that we leave people feeling completely alienated, completely deracinated, completely rootless, and lacking any sense of attachment. And I think that would only lead to sour resentment, because as humans, we all crave belonging. We all crave a sense of being a part of a group or wider community. And I think simply assuming that race is the only thing that can satisfy that craving is just so profoundly misguided, because I would argue that I feel a greater sense of affinity and kinship to any person, irrespective of their racial, ethnic, religious, or national background, that grew up in the same patch of Southeast London that I grew up in, than I would feel to a Black person that lived in America, or a Black person that lived in Senegal, or a Black person that lived in the Caribbean. And I think that approach of sort of emphasizing um, the local ties and the national ties of Black British people is much more constructive than simply emphasizing their racial identity above anything else.
Yeah, this concept of a civic identity under something that draws you together, coheres you around a symbol. I know Dr. Rakib Ehsan, the author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities, he was on the podcast, and he writes about how there are many things that can bind all of us, regardless of our ethnic minority status or otherwise, as British people. And I think elites have a big part to play in this. So a lot of our cultural elites are arguably sowing the seeds of division, perhaps without realizing it, as we've spoken about. But if I look at the monarchy, for example, two of the most touching moments, I think, in my life on the monarchy, with regards to the monarchy, happened in the last year and a half. There was the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, and when she was taken in state toward Westminster Abbey, and there were under the British flag, you had Scots and Irish pipers. You then had various different guards and troops, and then people of different colours, all walking under the same flag, as this is what binds us here. All of these different peoples and backgrounds, and yes, there's been conflict, but look, we've actually learned to live together and cooperate, and this is who we are. And then King Charles III's coronation. Clearly, this was the first coronation since 1952, and the demographics of the country have changed so much. And he did a pretty good job, I'd say, of representing the United Kingdom in all of its various different creeds, colours, and that was a uniting moment, or it could be, and I think they're the kind of things that we need more of, which is, look, actually there are different ways that we live, but look at the things that do hold us together, and it's more important that we're British rather than let's box ourselves off into whatever it is, either our religious background or our ethnic background.
And I think that sense of civic unity is so important. And the monarchy is one example through which that kind of civic identity can be expressed. I think another one is through sports. So you mentioned football earlier, and the various mixed race footballers sort of symbolizing the one of the positive changes in British society. And I feel I'm a big football fan. And I know that football is slightly different because football is based on England and Scotland and Wales rather than sort of a British identity. But I do feel that football is, or sports in general, whether that be cricket or rugby or any other kind of sport, is another way in which that kind of civic identity can be expressed. And in fact, you can plausibly make the case that religion is another example of that as well, because even though the UK is one of the most secular societies in the world, at a constitutional level, Britain is still a Christian country. And one of the striking things about London, for example, is that London is actually the most religious city in the UK, and one of the main reasons for that is that London is the most ethnically and racially diverse cities, and the extent to which Christianity plays an important role in the way in which Black British people identify themselves should never be underestimated. It's so integral to the way in which many Black British people see themselves. And there is a sort of interesting irony in the fact that without many of these Black African communities in London, the process by which Britain becomes a less religious society would be even more stark. And the reason why it's funny is because for many of these Black African communities, it was the UK, it was missionary societies from the UK that introduced Christianity to them in the 19th century. So it's almost a sort of weird kind of return. I'm almost tempted to say it's almost like a sort of reverse colonialism, but I don't want to sound like a sort of far right agitator.
No, don't worry. You're amongst friends here. I see the humor in that. The re-evangelization of the evangelists who lost their faith, as it were. That is a remarkable thing. I mean, I know when I visited churches in London, that's what strikes you, is that the white British population are. It's not that they're non-existent, but they're not really the most common people that you'll see in the churches. And you write in your book that the secularisation is predominantly a white British phenomenon, and I think you could probably go even further than that and say that it certainly has been led by our cultural elites, and I think those who I think people would refer to them as white liberals. I don't know how liberal they are, but I would say because they typically had their hands on the tiller with regards to the new ways of governing society and ideological currents, is that the post-Second World War is that Christianity was certainly shelved with that and diminished, I think, probably in the eyes of the public. And so that is quite an interesting irony, if there's anything in that whilst it's kind of been diminished in the eyes of the white British population, is that those that they champion, actually from ethnic minority backgrounds, are bringing religion back in through the back door, as it were.
Yeah. Well, but then there's also like the extent to which this is a positive thing is also complicated as well, because many religious communities, not only sort of like Christians, but also Muslims as well, espouse certain socially conservative views, and even some regressive social views as well, which complicates the kind of liberal, open, tolerant kind of society that many of us also want to see. So it is also complicated by that as well.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think we've touched on how this moment in time in particular feels like there's a bit of a reckoning with the various ideas, ideologies, and value conflicts that exist within our society. And I get the impression we're probably only just at the beginning of sorting those things out. Now they're coming into focus. On the American influence point, so I don't think we can avoid it, given that it is the English-speaking cultural hegemon. And also, as you write, the long arm of the American digital influence, all of the things that we use, probably the software we're using now, but certainly all the social media platforms, our search engines, they all sit in California, basically. And this Californication is then spread through the world algorithmically. And so it seems that we can't avoid the influence. So what brought these ideas over that we've talked a little bit about, for instance, certainly the popular notions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how they're sat on things like intersectionality and trying to sort people into more deserving groups based on their ethnic status and who they think are more, what's the right term, more deprived than others, and what are more privileged, and let's resort them. That also feels like the Overton window has shifted because of the conversation in America post October 7th. So we talked a bit about the Harvard, Penn's, the MIT things. In response to that, you've had influential people like Bill Ackman, who is a donor for Harvard, to start calling into question the tenets of DEI publicly. Elon Musk obviously owns X and Twitter, and he's someone who can just smash an Overton window just with one sentence, and seems to have done that. And then Vivek Ramaswamy, who was running for the Republican presidential pick, he spoke in no uncertain terms about what he thought about DEI, effectively saying, if the goal is to abolish systemic racism, let's not replace it with more systemic racism. So whilst you're arguing we need to see ourselves as not American, I think that's important, and we need to stop importing things from America, do you also think that current American public discourse is ultimately going to be the key to any change here in Britain, whether we like it or not?
I do think that the influence of America is inevitable for many of the reasons that you've mentioned, especially those pertaining to the use of social media. So anyone that uses social media, especially anyone that uses social media and lives in an Anglophone country, will inevitably encounter American culture, American society, American talking points, American debates. So I think it is inevitable and unavoidable. The key question and the key issue is the extent to which we can not allow it to influence our own understanding of the issues that pertain specifically to us. So I think another example would be the debates around abortion in America, and the fact that I noticed many people after the news about Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago, I noticed many people feeling frightened about that in the UK. But I think one important and one key difference between the UK and America is the extent to which religion doesn't really influence British politics to the extent that it influences American politics. And the kind of divisions and polarizations around an issue like abortion simply doesn't apply in the UK as it does in America. So the UK, and I think one important thing that we can do is to gain a better understanding about European countries that are closer to us. So I know next to nothing, for example, about the political culture of the Netherlands or Belgium, even though those countries are just across the English Channel. I know a bit about France, but I feel that it would be much more better if I knew more. And of course, the language barrier is one of the factors that influences this. But another example would be I know not that much about the politics and culture and society of Northern Ireland, for example, even though it is part of the UK. I know very little about it. So I do think we need to educate ourselves more about us and also about our neighboring European countries, and not allow American culture and American talking points to influence our own culture and talking points. Even though, as I say in the book, I am, as my example of The Sopranos illustrated, I am a big fan of many aspects of American culture. I love American TV. I love American films. I love American music. I love American fiction. I love so much of American culture, but I think I do recognize, and I think we should all recognize, that America is a foreign country.
Yeah, no, there's some words you don't hear very often. I think you're right. We almost meme ourselves into seeing ourselves as Americans or becoming more American or taking a cue from them. And as you mentioned, part of that's language. The other one is, I suppose you mentioned already, which is if we're just spending our lives networked into this amorphous blob of people who are ultimately imbibing most of the same talking points and flashpoints, and we're going to end up with a distorted view of ourselves. And I suppose this is the danger of spending a lot of our times online, which is a little bit like spending a lot of time in your head, but without actually spending it in your body and interacting with those people who are actually around you.
Yeah.
And this is something I think we need to fix. I don't know how that happens, how that a more national consciousness expands, but in some respects, the internet's been a sting in the tail. But it's always been there with regards to, everyone talks about the north-south divide. So having lived in both the north of England and the south of England, I certainly know it's there. But it's really interesting that during lockdown, when people weren't able to travel abroad, the amount of people that were born and raised in this country, regardless of whether they're white British or from any other ethnic minority background, had never really gone any further north than the Cotswolds, maybe. And
There's
predominantly they think, if I'm going to get away on holiday.
People in London that anywhere north of Watford is far too north.
Yeah, exactly. It's true, and it's and in the Northern English consciousness, you kind of get past Yorkshire, and you don't even really take Midlands into account. It's just you just see a sea of Cockneys, and that's about it. But there's just so many people who you'll speak to people decades into their life, and they've not been to the north of England or Scotland or whatever, and I think we do need to somehow fix that. But I guess maybe it's ever been thus. I mean, if you're from the southeast of England, we've been ultimately since the Norman invasion, we've been more hitched to the continent than we have been to anywhere else. And that Channel Tunnel is effectively just a modern way of showing that.
But don't you think that those kinds of divides are becoming even less of an issue now because of technology, for example? And I know that one striking development over the past few decades is the decline of certain regional dialects and certain regional accents. The fact that the sort of many of the accents and dialects in the UK are kind of sort of becoming flatter rather than more distinctive as they were in the past. And I think that must be due to the fact that through culture and technology and so forth, we are becoming a more integrated nation.
Yeah, I do think you're right. I mean, I've forever disappointed people for over 10 years with my very light, almost imperceptible Northumbrian accent. It used to be there until I started moving around the country, and I realized people don't really understand the dialect. So I had to flatten it out. But you are right. And, London's a great example, actually. What's quite funny, I think, actually, besides the London point, is that that flattening is typically in the past, people would attribute that to like a BBCification of the English tongue, where everyone spoke in received pronunciation. But what people are seeing the rise of now in London, not only have you seen the kind of the loss, I suppose, of the typical Cockney accent, but the rise of MLE, which I think is multicultural London English, but which was typically, I think, spoken by ethnic minorities, but now it's spreading even amongst white British, but nowhere near London. You see videos online of like these kids in East Anglia and these, chocolate. Honestly, it's really something to see.
It's funny. It's so funny.
But that's it is very funny. Very incongruous with the background in which they stand as well. This, kind of like a chocolate box kind of background, and they're just speaking in this tongue which is so alien to where they're from. But you are right. There does seem to be a bit of a flattening. That network effect, I suppose. I mean, it's the general homogenization of culture. I guess we say homogenization. It's with an American tilt, right?
Of course. And also Cockney as well. Because many of the white working class people in the East End have, of course, moved to Essex and Hertfordshire over the past few decades. And the sort of the Cockney accent is changed into something that's often called estuary English, which is a kind of softened version of the Cockney accents. And I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see where we're at in 30 years hence, because ultimately it's been the last 30 years, I think, which has seen such rapid changes in the way that we speak. Who knows what we'll be talking about then? I know we're probably approaching the end zone, so a couple of quick fire ones to you. Kemi Badenoch from the Conservative government has spoken in the past quite forcefully about Britain being the best place in the world to be black. What's your take on that?
I think amongst any other, I think she's probably right. If we're talking about living standards, and if we're talking about tolerance of people from a different ethnic or racial background, I think she's probably right about that. Even though I'm not one of those people that likes to sort of say, "Oh, this place is the best." That's not my style. And I think maybe paradoxically, maybe I'm very British in that kind of reserved, kind of sort of feeling a bit, I don't know, uncomfortable around being boastful. But I do think that all too often there is this kind of fashionable denigration of the UK, as a sort of fashionable tendency to always denigrate and to always demonize the UK. And I think that kind of attitude illustrates a profound ignorance about the rest of the world. Because, of course, the UK is not perfect by any means when it comes to racism, when it comes to bigotry, when it comes to prejudice. Of course, racism, bigotry, prejudice still exists in the UK and is still a problem that needs to be addressed. But when you compare it to the rest of the world, when you compare it to other countries across the world, then the UK is definitely amongst the most tolerant societies in the world, definitely.
It strikes me that actually the most commonly heard voices you'll hear saying things like that, Tom, are people from immigrant backgrounds, and that those people doing a lot of the Yeah. And I know you've been on the Trigonometry podcast, and Konstantin Kisin has become a real public figure in the last year or so, and on his most recent appearance on Question Time, he was asked a question by a member of the crowd, and to paraphrase him, he said, "Take it from me, as someone who's from the former Soviet Union, we need to stop talking Britain down. Like, that's not going to help us succeed, number one. But two, most of the charges we level at it, we could dismiss. That we make it out to be some uniquely evil places. Like, believe me, things could be much worse elsewhere. And look, you can't accuse me of being some kind of typical white British, pro-British person, because I was born in Russia." And there was someone in the crowd who heckled him repeatedly, wouldn't let him finish, and was shouting "shame on you" when he was trying to talk the country up, which is remarkable, really. Keir Starmer, we talked a little bit about the Race Equality Act and how you think that's a junk idea. So let's finish on, what would you advise political and business leaders to do to promote a healthy civic society rather than one that fractures along racial lines?
I think what I would advise businesses and politicians to do to promote a more healthy civic society is to not generalize about people based on their race, to take into account the fact that somebody's identity and somebody's position in the world is and can be influenced by other factors rather than their race. And in fact, to genuinely show respect to somebody, to genuinely treat somebody with a greater level of dignity, is to accept that to reduce that person to their race is to denigrate them.
Yes, here, and inherent human dignity. Now, there's something which I know is very deep within the Christian tradition,
Yes.
and perhaps there's no surprise that that's something that you're championing, Tom. Not that I know your religious persuasion, even if we have spoken about it, but that gives a sense of what the Western world ultimately is built upon, and I think it's really important we don't lose sight of the fact that there is an inherent human dignity, and that is a universal truth.
Yes.
And anything that goes against that is undermining it, and much to all of our detriment. Tom, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today. I've had a lot of fun. I was very glad to talk about Paulie Gualtieri as well. Amongst other things, I wasn't expecting that, but it's been a wonderful conversation. And I hope we can stay in touch and speak again in the future and keep fighting the good fight.
Definitely. Thank you very much, John.
That was wonderful. Thanks very much. Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @Thinking Class and follow me on X @Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and joining me on this journey.